All right, so we are kind of the first major work we're going to be reading together will be Homer's Odyssey. We'll be using Stanley Lombardo's translation. And before we do that, though, I think it's worth spending a little time talking a little bit about Homer, this the poet who to whom both these two great foundational mythological epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are credited to, and talking a little bit about kind of the poetry itself. We're recognizing that when we pick up a translation, an English translation of an ancient Greek poem, and we read it silently to ourselves, I think it's important to recognize that that very act actually puts us at several steps away from what it was as an experience for the people who first heard these stories. And I think that that kind of thing is one, it's just important as a cultural piece, but I think this will also help us to understand and appreciate these poems that much more. So I want to talk a little bit in this lecture about the figure of Homer. Like the figure of Hesiod, who I talked about in a previous lecture, Homer belongs to the same era, roughly this 8th century BC, roughly 700 BC, when Greece is awakening from these so-called Dark Ages and is starting to emerge in kind of fundamental kind of cultural ways. We're seeing the development of festivals, we're seeing the development of architecture, we're seeing the congregation of city-states, and Homer's poetry sits right at the beginning of that. Now, like with Hesiod, we call him semi-legendary because that's really the best that we can say. There are some scholars who believe there never was a Homer, that he's just a name, a kind of a persona attached to these stories. Some say there indeed was a Homer, though we can't really say anything concrete about him. That's the camp that I myself fall into. But he's this whoever Homer was. I mean, for the sake of argument, we're going to talk about him as if he were a real historical, living, breathing human being. He's most famous for these two works of literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are two kind of important pieces in this grand saga surrounding the Trojan War. Now, there's lots of stories surrounding the Trojan War that are not in Homer's epics. Most famously, the Trojan horse never appears in Homer's epics. Well, it actually appears as a kind of a flashback within a flashback in the Odyssey, but we never get it in real time. We never get the famous death of Achilles getting the arrow through his heel in Homer. There's lots of stuff outside of Homer that fills in the gaps in these legends. So we'll talk a little bit about that, where the Iliad and the Odyssey fall. But they are really kind of just two important pieces. I mean, arguably the most important pieces of this grand saga of legend that surrounds this famous war, which we call the Trojan War. Now, the Trojan War, I mean, there's some actually fairly persuasive archaeological evidence that suggests that there was a Trojan War. Now, whether that means there was an Odysseus and Achilles, that's a whole other question. But the Greeks, in their own kind of view of themselves historically, they certainly thought of the Trojan War as a real event. And traditionally, it ran, if we translate this into our calendar, from 1194 to 1184 BC. So Homer is singing these songs, writing these poems, performing these stories about legends that took place, or events that took place, as you can compare the dates here, about 500 years before Homer himself. More on that in just a second. So, like I said, we don't know much about who Homer was. I mean, there are these traditions that he was that he lived on what we call the Ionian coast, this western coast of Turkey today, which was part of Greek lands back in antiquity. There are more ancient claims, the island of Chios and the city of Smyrna, that claimed Homer as their hometown guy, but there's really not much kind of biographical foundation to really stand on here. Now, I think it's important for any mythology class to grapple with Homer. We won't be really reading the Iliad in its entirety. You'll be reading pieces of it and summaries of it in the Powell text. We'll be reading the Odyssey in its entirety. But I think it's any mythology class that skipped over Homer would not be doing its job. And so while the ancient Greeks didn't have what we might call, scripture or holy scripture, in the way that, a Jew or a Christian would look to biblical texts, or a Muslim would look to the Quran. This is about as close as it gets. Homer, fairly quickly, within a century or two, was embedded in Greek culture and was endlessly used and quoted and mined and studied and interpreted for all kinds of different reasons beyond just the telling of a good story. So it's essential to understand a bit about Homer, to understand who the ancient Greeks were, and how they saw themselves. Now, a bit about kind of the poetry itself. This is in the grand scheme of things, it's a fairly recent discovery and realization that whoever Homer was, he was not a poet that wrote with ink on papyrus. He did not compose these things and write them down, but rather he was what we call an oral poet, kind of a keeper of the lore, and was likely a poet performing these stories at a time before there was even a Greek alphabet, or while the Greek language was kind of concretized, it was becoming an alphabetic thing. So he was Homer. I think most scholars who talk about Homer as a real person agree that he was likely a poet in a pre-literate society. There was the Greek language, but there was no kind of concrete Greek alphabet. There was no literacy to any degree, and so he was a poet that actually performed these songs from a vast storehouse of memory, which again boggles the modern rational mind. But there are some scholars who believe that in these pre-literate societies, there was a premium and power of memory that we can only dream of today in our kind of more or less kind of hyper-literate age. So he was a poet that sang these songs in a particular meter, what we call the dactylic hexameter. And both the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed in this particular kind of rhythm. And we think that when Homer performed these songs, he sang them. There was very likely a musical accompaniment, but he sang them in this rhythm, in this kind of this beat, that certainly would have aided a poet relying on a storehouse of memory to tell these stories. Now, a little bit, don't mean to frighten you here, this is a little bit of ancient Greek for you here. What you're looking at here are the opening lines to Homer's Iliad. This is Ilias in ancient Greek, which is the ancient Greek title. We say Iliad. Well, that title simply comes from Ilium, was another name for the city of Troy. So Ilias or Iliad in Greek just means the things having to do with Ilium, or some things about Troy, or something like that. And this little schematic at the top shows you kind of the core rhythm of a line of dactylic hexameter. It has a very kind of distinct kind of loping rhythm to it. So it's called hexameter, hexa 6. So each line of poetry in both the Iliad and the Odyssey is made up of what we call 6 feet. And each foot has a rhythm, kind of a pure hexameter line would be a long note followed by 2 short notes. So you get this kind of dum dee dee 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 dum dum rhythm to it. And that's the rhythm that carries throughout the whole poem. And of course that's a rhythm that once you translate it from ancient Greek into any other language, you immediately lose that. That goes away. It's an impossibility really to kind of keep that rhythm and to translate it into anything that resembles the actual thing. All right. So while again this is not a course in ancient Greek, I think it's important to kind of understand kind of the artifact that we're talking about here. And so and there's also a bit about the language, I think, that helps us understand why Homer's doing what he's doing. So I just want to kind of read to you these first 7 lines of the Iliad in ancient Greek, in that rhythm, to give you at least a little bit of a sense of what it may have sounded like, what it felt like back in antiquity. Of course, there's a pitch element, there's a musical element that's been lost, but the rhythm remains. So this would have sounded something like this. Me ninayede te ya peleia jo akileos, ulemenein hemuria kaios alge teke, polas difthimus sukasaide proapsen, hera on autuste heloria teuche chunesen, oia noisite pasi dios te alea tobule, exudeta prota diastete nerasante, atre edeste anax andron kai dios achilleos. So you can hear a little bit of that rhythm. Actually, that very first line is almost a pure hexameter line. Meninayede te ya peleia jo akilaos. And again, you don't have to know ancient Greek to recognize some things here. You can see Achilleos. This is Achilles. Here's another form of his name down here. Achilleos. They would say in ancient Greek, we say Achilles. Now, what surprises a lot of students who are new to the Iliad but maybe know something about the Trojan War is that the Iliad is not really the story of the Trojan War. Well, it is, but it isn't. The Iliad, if it's 24 books of poetry, just like the Odyssey is, but if you count from the very beginning to the very end, it really only amounts to about 49, 50 days in the whole war, and kind of sort of towards the end of the war, in the 10th year of the war, 10th and last year of the war. But we don't get the end of the war. We don't get the beginning of the war. We get this small little slice. And so when the Iliad ends, Achilles is still alive. The Trojan horse thing hasn't happened yet. So the question is, well, what's Homer up to? Why would he have these thousands and thousands of lines of poetry for such a tiny slice? Really, literally a month and a half of a 10-year war. Well, it's a difficult question to answer, but many people point to the language to answer this. This very first word here would transliterate into English as M-long-E-N-I-N, Mainin. That's the very first word. And that word is the word rage. This first line translates to something like, "Sing to me, goddess." So this is Homer invoking the muse, kind of a goddess of poetry, to kind of sing through him. He's saying, "I'm just a vessel, and the divine is speaking through me." So he's, "Sing to me, goddess, about," and then we pick up the rage. Sing to me about the rage of Achilles, the son of Peleus here. So you have to kind of bounce all around here to get kind of a straight prose translation into English here. But one of the things about ancient Greek that's vastly different than English, aside from the different alphabet, is that ancient Greek is what we call an inflected language. That is, word order doesn't really matter. Whereas in English, if you switch a couple of words around in a sentence, it doesn't take much for that to be, to render it nonsense. Well, in ancient Greek, it's the ending of the words that tell you who's doing what to whom, not the order in which they come. So that for a poet who has to adhere to a rhythm and has to kind of keep this beat, that's an absolute gift, because that means you can really rearrange the words any way that you want. And it's thought that the most important word in your whole 18,000 line poem is the very first word. And that's in some ways, and it's a bit of a romantic interpretation, but it's that first word that really kind of gives away the game, that tells you exactly what you're up to. So Homer says here, he does not sing, "I'm sing to me, goddess, about the story of the Trojan War front to back." He's saying, no, sing to me about the rage of Achilles. That's what this story is about. And again, if you look at kind of the arc of the action over the 24 books of the Iliad, indeed that is a guide stone. The first part tells us why Achilles gets so angry. The middle part tells us what happens when Achilles gets angry, how he reacts to this. And the Iliad ends with Achilles setting his anger aside. So he gets his rage, he is driven by his rage, he confronts his rage, he deals with his rage, and then he sets his rage aside. And that takes you really from day 1 to roughly day 49. And so again, it's Homer saying, this is what the story is really about. It's not really about the whole Trojan War. This is a small piece, and I'm zooming in with my microscope on this piece. So keep that in mind, as you read the Powell text, which will flesh out a lot more detail from the Iliad. On a linguistic level, we can see some really interesting things happening here. Here's a famous kind of traditional portrait of Homer. Again, we have no idea what the man looked like. This is not a portrait of the day, but by tradition, at the height of his powers, he was an older man, bearded, bald in many depictions, and blind. That's often a signal that something divine is happening. I mean, this is a trope that you see in lots of fantasy stories, that blind characters are often prophetic. This idea that they lose their physical sight, but they gain a kind of second supernatural sight. And so it's fitting that Homer would be a blind poet, because he has these divine powers of performance and memory. Some maps. We'll be looking at lots of maps together. So here's the, more or less everything that you see here was part of the ancient Greek world. I mean, today this is the Greek mainland of the nation of Greece, including the island of Crete. This would be Turkey today. But in antiquity, this whole kind of coast of Turkey would have been Greek lands. In fact, there are Greek ruins all up and down this coast here in many in very, very, still very, very good repair. Here at the top, in the northwest corner of what we call Turkey today, there's Ilium. There's Troia, or Troy. This is where the Trojan War took place, and where archaeologists, many believe that there was something that happened, maybe some cataclysmic event that gave rise to all of these legends down through the centuries. And but the tradition is that Homer belonged to this area, and he traveled from place to place, from town to town, to court, to square, singing these songs. And it's very likely that he was probably one of dozens of poets doing this kind of thing. In a pre-literate society, this is how you kept your history alive. This is how you kept your stories alive. It was the poet's job to shape this and to drive this and to keep this. And so the idea is that over time, Homer's versions of these stories came to be vastly preferred. And so when the alphabet caught up and these things could finally be written down and the culture gained at least some level of literacy, it was Homer's versions that had embedded themselves in the culture of memory of the time. His versions got written down to a degree and spread and were copied to a degree that we can still translate and read them today. Now, like I said, Homer's Iliad is just a small piece of this grand saga of Troy. So I wanted to kind of talk about briefly. I mean, the Powell text talks about these two, but some of the key backstories, surrounding stories to Homer's Iliad here. The whole ball gets rolling with a story that's usually called the Judgment of Paris. So Paris is this hapless young prince. He's the brother of Hector. He's who is kind of the great warrior for the Trojans. And at this wedding feast amongst the Greeks, he's called upon to judge who gets this golden apple. And it's one of these things that Paris, once he's put into this situation, he's doomed. You can read about that in the Powell text, the details of it. But Paris ultimately is the one who runs off with Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, who happens to be married to King Menelaus, king of Sparta, one of the most powerful, fiery-tempered Greek kings and warriors there is. And this sets the stage for the whole kind of Greeks versus Trojans conflict. Menelaus is the one who has been dishonored. His wife has been kidnapped, taken away, or depending on what version you read, she runs off with Paris and has an affair. And so the war is about restoring his honor, and for the rest of the Greeks, it's a chance to win glory on the battlefield. Now, another thing that often surprises new readers to kind of the stories of the Trojan War is these are not stories that glorify war. I would say, if I had to kind of render a judgment, I would say quite the opposite. These are cautionary tales, kind of how not to be a warrior. In the Iliad and in the Odyssey, I think we do find scenes which Homer's saying, this is how you live heroically. But for the most part, the Iliad in particular is a story about how war drives men to madness, drives them to kind of give up their humanity. And that's certainly what happens to Achilles, really up until the very, very, very end of that poem. So there's lots of these stories that kind of cast a shadow of the horrors to come. And one of the most famous ones is so King Agamemnon. He's the king of Mycenae, which is the most powerful city amongst the Greeks, and so it falls to him to be the leader of the Greek expedition to Troy. And this famous story, he gathers all the Greek other kings and their own armies, and they're waiting to set sail from Greece to Troy, but the winds won't blow, and they're stuck there day after day. No wind, no sailing, no war. And so the warriors are sitting there on the beach, and they're getting restless, and they're all looking to Agamemnon, like, well, what are we going to do? I mean, what's the plan here? So Agamemnon has his priests kind of consult the oracles and the gods and see what's going on. Could there be some divine reason? And indeed there is. The goddess Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and the wild, are upset. Now there are different versions of the story, but many of them go that there were some men who are sick of their daily rations of bread and water, and they go into the forest and they kill a deer and skin it and roast it, not knowing that that deer was sacred to the goddess Artemis. So Artemis, in upset about this, causes the winds to stop. And so in those oracles, they also find out what the goddess requires to solve this. And she demands a human sacrifice, and not just any human sacrifice. She demands that Agamemnon sacrifice his own beloved youngest daughter, Iphigenia, and he does so. And Agamemnon's wife, that is the mother Iphigenia, sees this with her own eyes, not knowing not knowing anything that this was planned, sees this horror take place. And so Agamemnon sacrifices his own beloved daughter so that the expedition can go forward. Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, sees this and immediately starts planning revenge. And so when Agamemnon comes home from the war, his wife has been having an affair and she has him murdered. So these dark ironies, the Greeks love these dark ironies. So by Agamemnon, by sacrificing his daughter so that the war could happen, he's actually pounding the nails in his own coffin. He's already setting the stage for his own bloody murder. Also Odysseus, who we'll meet and talk about very, very soon. I think there's sometimes kind of this cartoonish idea about these Greek stories that these warriors were all gung-ho to go and fight and kill and die on the battlefield, and there's some of that. But so many of these stories, again, like I say, cast a shadow that suggests that this is really kind of a horrible thing that human beings are funneled into. And so there's a famous story where Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus, they're going around Greece and they're drafting the various kings and their armies, and they come to Odysseus' island of Ithaca. And Odysseus has heard, that these guys were coming, and Odysseus he and his wife Penelope have just had a new baby boy, and he doesn't want to go. He doesn't want to go. He wants to stay home. He wants to raise his son. He wants the quiet life on the battlefield. In his palace and being king over his quiet island people. And so when Agamemnon and Menelaus come, Odysseus arranges so that he's plowing out in his fields, but he's plowing like a crazy man and plowing, rows that are not parallel but all over the place, and he's foaming at the mouth, and he's hoping that he can kind of plead insanity and get out of this. And Agamemnon and Menelaus, they know Odysseus, they know that he's kind of the supreme trickster, and so they suspect something's up. And so what they do is they take his infant son Telemachus, who we'll meet very soon, and they place it right in the path of the plow. And of course Odysseus turns the plow to save his child, and thereby proves his sanity. And they pack him up and they take him off to Troy. Now, once Odysseus is in Troy, he plays the role of warrior quite well. But again, kind of this backstory is always a reminder that so many of these warriors just didn't want to be there at all. Achilles, who is by and large the main character in the Iliad, the greatest Greek warrior that has ever lived. Somewhere along the line, he's born as as a demigod to a mortal's father, Peleus, and a minor sea goddess, Thetis. And he becomes the figure of tragedy and pathos and philosophy and humanity and the lack of humanity in the Iliad. And then the war, again, depending who you read, lasts 10 years or almost 10 years, or it's almost 10 years by the time the Iliad starts. And so all kinds of famous events and battles and duels and things have happened before Homer starts the action to his story. And so, like I said, the Iliad itself only covers about a month and a half, about 49 days near the end of the war. And where that comes from is if you count how many times Homer says the sun goes up and the sun goes down, to kind of bracket the action in the Iliad, it's about 49 times. There's another famous story. We'll look at kind of some later art. This is not an ancient piece of art. This is actually post-Renaissance. But Greek mythology, in particular Homeric legends and Trojan legends, were a favorite of Renaissance and post-Renaissance artists. And there's another famous story that Achilles' mother, Thetis, didn't want her boy to go off to Troy. She knew that he was kind of destined to die there, that he would never come home. And so what she does is she hides him away on this island of Skyros in the middle of the Aegean Sea. And he actually dresses up like a woman. He dresses in drag to hide his identity from any drafters that might come by. Well, the story usually goes is that Agamemnon, Menelaus, And now Odysseus, who's been packed up with them, they arrive on this island and they're looking, to draft young, able-bodied men for the war effort. And the young women of the town come down to greet their guests, and they give gifts. And the men on the boats also have gifts for the young ladies. And Odysseus sees this one odd-looking woman who's a little bit kind of stands out, and he suspects something's up. And so Odysseus lays a bunch of gifts out for the women, and many of them are kind of cliched, stereotypical feminine gifts like perfume and clothes and jewelry. But he also leaves out a brand new set of shiny armor, a helmet, a sword, and a shield. And of course, Achilles can't help himself. He wants nothing to do with the perfume and the jewelry, but he goes right for the sword and shield. And so this artist has him having the helmet on. He's admiring himself in the mirror here. So again, it's a comic tale, absolutely. But it's also, again, like the drafting of Odysseus is a story which talks about how Achilles himself perhaps didn't even want to go. This warrior that's sometimes depicted as the most gung ho of them all. Here's another one. This is by the painter Rubens, again, post-Renaissance. He was famous for his kind of the voluptuous women that he would paint. This is the Judgment of Paris. So here Paris is offering the apple to Aphrodite. Actually, Aphrodite's right here. She's gonna look like she's saying like, "Who, me, really?" The other goddesses that are in the running. This is Athena here, which is really interesting. Is that Rubens paints her in this kind of eroticized, sexualized kind of way, which the ancient Greeks never depicted Athena in that regard. She was fiercely virginal, as they called her. And we'll talk about Athena very soon. So Rubens is really going against kind of the Greek grain by depicting Athena in this way, but you can see her shield with the head of Medusa back there and her helmet. This is Aphrodite, goddess of sex, lust, and love. Little Cupid here alongside her. And this is Hera, queen of the gods, with a peacock being one of her symbols. But Aphrodite promises Paris that if she gives him the apple, that she would give him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. But she doesn't tell him, of course, the most beautiful woman in the world happens to be married to the host of the party that they're at, and it sets this whole kind of awful thing in motion. This guy back here, this is Hermes, the messenger of the gods, again, who we'll look at specifically down the line, one of the most easily recognizable deities. Here he kind of represents kind of a link between mortal and immortal. He's often kind of the bridge between those two worlds. You'll see him in the Odyssey play that role on a couple of occasions. Now, there's this whole other body of legends that the Greeks refer to as the nostoi. Nostoi is the ancient Greek word for return or going back to. I'm sure you've heard the word nostalgia, like when you're kind of wistfully thinking about your past. And nostalgia is a Greek word which literally means the pain of going back, the pain of the return. And so there was this whole body of legends called the nostoi, which were kind of whatever happened to stories about what happened to various figures who survived the Trojan War, what happened to them after the war. Some, very few of them end happily. There's Ajax the Greater, who we'll talk about later. He commits suicide at Troy. Ajax the Lesser, he's blasted by a Zeus-thrown thunderbolt in the middle of the ocean as he attempts to get home. Agamemnon, he's murdered upon his return. Depending on who you read, he's either murdered by his wife's lover, or he's stabbed to death in the bathtub by his wife, by Clytemnestra, his wife herself. Diomedes, who in the Iliad famously wounds Aphrodite. Cuts her hand and causes her to bleed on the battlefield. Does battle with the gods themselves. He comes home and Aphrodite has her revenge, and he finds that his wife has been unfaithful to him. Menelaus get Helen back, but it's not really a happily ever after. They get blown off course. They're lost for years. They come limping back home to Sparta, where they live a kind of weird, strange existence. You'll see them. There's a scene in the Odyssey where Odysseus' son, Telemachus, goes to visit them. And you'll see the kind of relationship that they have here, years after the war. Nestor, you'll meet him too in the Odyssey. He's the exception. Nestor is he's an old gentleman, regal gentleman that everybody likes. The Greeks love him. The Trojans love him. He's kind of a man without enemies. His only real problem is that he talks too much, and it's hard to get him to shut up. But he's beloved by everybody. and he's an honorable man, and he honors the gods. You'll see him doing these things in the Odyssey. So it's not a surprise that he makes it back home to his hometown of Pylos without a scratch on him. And then there's Odysseus. So he is the most famous of these nostoi. He is the most famous nostos of them all. So he spends 10 years at Troy fighting as a warrior, and then it takes him another 10 years to get back home to Ithaca, and that's what our story, the Odyssey that we'll be reading together, is about his return and the retaking of his household and his reunion with his son Telemachus, who he hasn't seen since he was a baby boy, and reunion with his wife Penelope, again, whom he hasn't seen in 20 years. So keep in mind, this is just scratching the surface, but Homer's epics, as foundational as they are really just a small slice of this massive body of mythology that we call the Trojan Saga. All right, that's enough for this one. See you soon.